Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are concluding our series today on the deep state, its formation, uh, and all of we're going to review all these questions here in a minute, but going all the way back to the 1860s when the deep state was formed. And of course, it, as we remember, if you've been with me from the start, it was a private sector phenomena after the Civil War, the rise of corporations. But with the the desire for overseas expansion, it became quickly apparent the private sector was going to need the public sector to play a role, i.e., the military, because colonization or imperialism is not going to happen without the backing of the United States Army, the military. So we see gradually over time a merging of the private public sector, which means a merging into the public sector of the private sector operating principle of ultravires. This is where things really got dicey because ultravires, the operating principle said, we care only about profits. We don't care about public interest. And if somebody comes along who does care about public interest, we fire them or we eliminate them in some manner, shape, form. And then the last component of ultravires was to immunize yourself, your company, all your board members, uh, your CEO, everybody, from any sort of liability going forward. And you remember, this is going back a little ways, but originally the private sector immunized itself legally from liability, but also financially by creating shell companies to hide their revenues and their income so they didn't have to pay taxes. And then in the case of a lawsuit, one of the ways they immunized themselves legally was to, or from civil liability, was to spread out their assets amongst all these different subsidiaries so that when you sued the company, you were suing just a small piece of the company. They hid all their assets. So if you did get access or win a lawsuit, you didn't get very much. So they were clever. They were experts at immunizing themselves. Anyway, when that operating principle bled into the public sector through World War I and World War II, because two presidents in those two world wars, both progressives, ironically, Wilson and FDR, requested the help of these, quote, best and brightest private sector corporatists to come help run the wartime economy. And then, of course, they're going to bring with them ultravires. So that's when they discovered that there was a new business model that was immeasurably more lucrative than what they were doing, building widgets or whatever. And that was continual war. And I went through several presentations of the benefits to these companies financially during wartime and how their profits increased 100%, 200%, 300%. I said, boy, if we ever get a chance to affect public policy or foreign policy, wouldn't it be great if we could continue these wars uh, into the great unknown and we would just make money as if we were always at war forever. And so that's how World War II eventually bled into World War One, eventually bled into World War II, which eventually transitioned nicely right into the Cold War. And so we spent the rest of this series talking about the Cold War era deep state, which is this new, unaccountable, unelected, in many cases, shadow government that is operating first and foremost with the idea that we're going to maximize profits or maximize benefits to ourselves. We don't care about the public interest. And if somebody comes along who's an obstacle to that, we will remove that person. And then ultimately we will always immunize ourselves from any and all liability. And that has become the operating principle since. Now, I'm differentiating the Cold War era deep state from today's deep state. We'll get into a little discussion about that here at the end today. But the Cold War era deep state was defined as the national security apparatus and all the industries that fed it. And it operated under this ultravires principle, which again is maximize benefits to yourself, minimize the public interest, eliminate the obstacles, and immunize yourself. And in doing so, they transition from committing treachery against the American people to treason. And treason we define as aiding and abetting the enemy. It's trying to overthrow the government. It's trying to overthrow or kill your king. It's uh, it's betraying your own people. So that's the subject matter of this entire series. Those three definitions. If you're familiar with those, you pretty much know the sum and substance of this channel, of this entire series, the Treasonous Cabal. Today, we're going to finish where we've been talking about the FBI and its role that it played in this deep state plot against JFK, for example, but others in the 60s and up to and including Watergate in the 70s as well. But we kind of center around the JFK assassination because it created a template for all the others going forward. Anyway, we're going to answer those final questions today that we've been going over every day in this, as far as the FBI is concerned, 14-part series. So one of the questions was, what were the payoffs as a result of FBI providing cover and participating in this plot? What were the payoffs to the various conspirators? So here we are. We finally arrived. And the first payoff, which I put at the top, because I think these business elites are the movers and shakers of plots like these. And of course, they're the ones that bleed back into their melt back into the ether, to the woodwork, and disappear from public view, only to do it again a year later, or 2 years later, or 10 years later, whatever. They never seem to face any sort of liability at all. Everybody talks about the JFK assassination, talks about the CIA, they talk about the FBI, they talk about the Secret Service, they talk about LBJ, they talk about the mob, they talk about the anti-Castro Cubans, they talk about all these different, the Pentagon. I don't hear anybody really discuss much the H.L. Hunts of the world. They see they get off the hook. I put them at the top because they're the ones who pay the bills. They set the plan and they pay the bills. And all these governmental actors fall in line and do their bidding. So that is with respect to the JFK assassination. I call it the Sweet 8F Mafia. You're talking about that group that ran out of the Lamar Hotel down in Houston, included high-ranking politicos like LBJ, John Connally, Albert Thomas was in there, a bunch of state-level judges, elected personnel, but then also the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. Richard Nixon was in it, future president, right? Former vice president. And so it went beyond the borders of the state of Texas. Richard Nixon, for example, was not a Texas politician. All the big Texas oilmen, Clint Murchison, H.L. Hunt, Sid Richardson, Harold Dryholz-Byrd, the Brown and Root construction boys, George and Herman Brown, who backed LBJ's career from the beginning to the end. And these folks were all heavily invested in this plot. They had financial motives. And so you look at the payoffs. Once JFK is out of the way, the first payoff is to LBJ himself. He was on the verge of going to jail. Instantly, his legal issues vanished. Instead of being in a prison cell, he's now in the Oval Office. He's the president, which, if you're the Sweet 8F group, all of your efforts to support his career from congressman to senator to vice president has now paid off, because your guy, the guy who owes you everything, is now in the Oval Office. You can get whatever, you can call a meeting. He'll always take your meeting. He'll always take your phone call. And so you talk about having your hand on being the power behind the throne, so to speak. That was big for all of them, not just for LBJ. Then Hoover, as a result of LBJ's new position, is now appointed FBI director for life. That was his personal motive in all of this. He was tired of being on the chopping block all the time by the Kennedys, having to explain and justify his job. The oil depletion allowance remained at 27.5%, which was big money to these big oil guys. The Kennedy Act was abandoned, which again is big money to these oil guys. Kennedy Act had to do with overseas investment income and how much of it you could hide in foreign banks, etc. away from the tax man, right? Oil depletion allowance said first 27.5% oil that you drill for when you wildcat is tax free. This is big money savings for the Texas oilmen. Some people estimate it was over $300 million a year. Just one of those, the oil depletion allowance. Who knows what the Kennedy Act would have been worth? And then, of course, LBJ's first act would be greenlighting the Vietnam War, which is going to be big money to all of these business elites, this old mafia group. And it exceeds just those folks out of Texas. Okay. There's a bunch of other companies that are going to do very well as a result of this Vietnam War. But just keeping it to this plot, you're talking about the Texas oilmen who are going to have to uh, power or provide energy for this war. This war is going to be 9,000 miles away. That's a lot of ships going across a long ocean. That's a lot of planes, and they all need oil, right? And you still have your domestic demand. So a lot of money to be made in the course of a Vietnam War for big oil. Brown and Root Construction. Uh, some of these Texas companies are going to be the builders of the Vietnam infrastructure to carry out this war, dredging the bays, building the bases, building the airstrips, clearing the ground. It goes on and on. It's big money. No war, no money. A war, lots of money. Then we get into the FBI and the Secret Service, and you see a sort of crossover, intersecting of motives. Both of these organizations were adamantly anti-communist and viewed Kennedy as a threat to our national security because they thought he was soft on communism. Both of these organizations were adamantly anti-civil rights and viewed Kennedy as a threat to our culture, our way of life, because he was making civil rights increasingly, as time went on, more and more a centerpiece of his administration, of his policy goals and aims. And on the part of the Secret Service, they were extremely concerned about JFK's personal behavior, his drug use, his womanizing, et cetera, especially with respect to whom he was womanizing with. Some of them were uh, Soviet spies. And of course, that intrigued J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI as well. So you look at all three of these reasons, and all three of those concerns were addressed. As far as the FBI and the Secret Service were concerned with the assassination of JFK. Now, these next two I don't consider as part of the conspiracy as far as the planners. They're the useful instruments. But these useful instruments have extreme motive as well. Organized crime has been double crossed by JFK and his brother Bobby. This is their vengeance. Organized crime has, part of that double cross was that they were going to get back into Cuba. And now they find out that he's actually back channeling with Castro to normalize relations, which means Castro's government's going to survive and they're going to be permanently kicked out of Cuba, lose all that income. And then the other part of the double cross was the Justice Department and all the harassment, these new racketeering laws, the harassment by the Justice Department. He had promised a friend in the White House, and he had not delivered. So there are people in this world you can, and organizations in this world you can double cross. Organized crime's not one of them. They don't take that sitting down. They don't let that pass. The anti-Castro Cubans, who had all their hopes in Kennedy at the Bay of Pigs, dashed. And in their view, was because he was weak. He had his hand on the chicken switch, right? And then they had their hopes on him again a year later at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they were dashed yet again because he took the Weasley way out in their view. And then Operation Mongoose, he had their hopes up again, and then he dashed those hopes when he canceled Operation Mongoose, and he started seizing and closing down the bases and seizing all the weapons and ammo. And now they find out he's got a secret back channel with Castro, trying to normalize it. There's just one too many betrayals. He'd made a series of promises, one of them very publicly at the Orange Bowl, and yet privately he was double crossing anti-Castro Cubans just as hard as he was organized crime. And of course, these anti-Castro Cubans were instruments of the CIA. And the CIA's goal was a war with Cuba. And so if you're double crossing anti-Castro Cubans, you're undercutting the CIA. Of course, when you get to these conspirators, the CIA, the Pentagon, uh, the assassination of JFK effectively ended his war against the CIA and all of their objectives, their foreign policy objectives. They had had free run from 52 to 60 with Nixon and Eisenhower. All of a sudden, from 60 to 63 during JFK's 1,000 days, their their free ride was over, and Kennedy was cutting their taking away some of their covert responsibilities, giving it to the Pentagon. He was taking some slashing their budget. He had fired the top three guys in the CIA. He had a very public war going against the CIA, and all that just disappeared. And up to and including the fact he was never going to greenlight a war in Cuba. He was never going to greenlight a war in Vietnam. And these are both CIA wet dreams, so to speak. Another payoff to the CIA and the Pentagon was the first thing LBJ did when he became president was greenlight the Vietnam War, giving them what they wanted. In fact, if you're gonna prefer one over the other, would you rather have a war in Cuba or Vietnam? You can't have both. And of course, Vietnam's the big enchilada. It's 9,000 miles away. It's going to go on a lot longer, and that means a lot more money for a lot longer time. So Vietnam became, and he gave it to him. He gave the Cold War. If Kennedy wins a second term, the Cold War would have ended. You could make a case, same thing a few years later when Nixon was president at Dayton. The Cold War was a financial boondoggle for this national security apparatus and all the industries that fed it, deep state. They wanted the Cold War to continue. They were not interested in peace. It's the guys who fought for peace in the 60s and the 70s that died. The guys who want to continue war, they continue on unabated. And then the other payoffs to the CIA and Pentagon was that the back channels behind the CIA's back, negotiating with Castro, negotiating with Khrushchev, the nuclear arms, the testing freeze, etc., with the goal towards nuclear disarmament. Boy, the CIA and the Pentagon were just terrified of these back channels and what could be accomplished. All that ended the day JFK died. So you see here is a ton of payoffs to conspirators, which I've named five. I've named five as part of this deep state conspiracy. And the Suite 8F guys are right at the top. And then you had LBJ. And then you got the FBI. You got the CIA. And you got the Pentagon. Those are your five conspirators. Organized crime and anti-Castro Cubans are the useful instruments. And in some cases, there's they're one and the same, right? Because a lot of the anti-Castro Cubans were part of Santos Traficante's crime family. So the Cubans were organized crime, at least down in Florida. So those are the payoffs. And if I were to try to nail down where this whole conspiracy began, I think it begins where I've got it circled in red. This ultravires principle, operating principle, was started off in the private sector and bled into the public sector and became the operating principle of this deep state. And remember the four components. It's all about private interest or maximizing profits to yourself. Public interest doesn't matter. You fire anybody who stands in the way, which in private industry is very easy to do. When you get into the public sector and you're talking about elected politicians, you can't fire them. You can try to get them unelected, but if they're going to get reelected because they're standing for the public interest and the people like them, then you have to resort to more drastic means such as assassination. And then lastly, you immunize yourself. So I believe out of this operating principle flows everything that followed. The the private interest that motivates all these plots, all this treason is going to be money. It's going to be this new business model, which is unlimited war. It's going to be unfettered business practices for the big oil guys, and of course you get into the illicit enterprises, the illegal ones that the CIA was involved in, that JFK was stepping on the drug trade was financing a lot of the covert operations. Obviously, organized crime, all their illicit enterprises, uh, all these covert operations, which were borderline illegal, certainly not ethical or in the public interest. Uh, but ultravires says public interest doesn't matter. It's private interest. It's maximizing profits. Really, if you want to boil it down, it's all about money. And then out of that demand for maximization of profits uh, comes the next step, which is to terminate any obstacles to that maximization of profits. And the deep state looked and they saw that JFK was standing in the way. Now, prior to that, in the 40s, or when FDR was president, actually in the 30s, they tried to overthrow uh, FDR because his New Deal policies were infringing on these deep state uh, profits. And they didn't like the shifting of the nation's wealth from the very rich, the very wealthy, the 50 or 60 men that are running everything, to uh, the poor people, the people that have been left behind by the Great Depression. So they tried to overthrow his government. They tried to force him out. By the time we get to Kennedy, they're not playing games anymore. We're not trying to force him out through a blackmail situation or whatever. We're going to kill him because he is standing in the way. And we're going to, the plotters are going to be these deep state uh, entities led by these sweet 8F guys who have all the money. It's going to involve the CIA, who has the expertise already built up through executive action in assassinating foreign heads of state. We'll just bring that program home. We're going to involve the FBI, who needs to provide cover for the CIA and immunity afterwards because they're in charge of the investigation. We're going to involve the Pentagon. The Pentagon, somebody's going to have to corrupt this uh, autopsy afterwards to make the conspiracy stick, to provide the immunity that we need. There's a naval hospital in Washington that'll make that happen. We're going to involve the Secret Service because somebody has to lay down on the job to open up the target, to lead the target like a lamb to the slaughter. And so those are your deep state conspirators. And then we're going to use as mechanics to carry this out the local police, first in Dallas, then in New York with Malcolm X, NYPD, then in Memphis with Martin Luther King, then in LA with Bobby Kennedy, and then ultimately uh, the in Washington with Watergate, with the Nixon situation. But we're also going to use, as part of the mechanics, organized crime. These folks are going to be very handy instruments when it comes to silencing witnesses, for example, like Jack Ruby, right? Keeping Lee Harvey Oswald quiet. Or we'll appoint our mob attorneys to represent these patsies, and they'll plead guilty or they'll confess as long as we pay them off well. And then we'll use the anti-Castro Cubans. These anti-Castro Cubans are assets. They're CIA assets. They've been trained by the CIA. They are the hit teams. They're the ones that can carry out, uh, we'll let them get blood on their hands, kind of a thing. That's the thing about these sweet 8Fers. They pay for everything, but they don't get their hands dirty. All these other folks are the ones that get their hands dirty. And then after the event, the last stage of ultravires is to immunize everybody, part of the plot. And that's going to involve FBI. And that's where the LBJ really comes in. LBJ and the FBI, it's not a coincidence that LBJ's best friends with the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. And so they sort of work together. I guess I could have included the CIA in that as well, but FBI ultimately is responsible for domestic intelligence and all the investigation. The work product went from the FBI to the Warren Commission, which of course was appointed by LBJ. And that provided cover for everybody. And just like J. Edgar Hoover set the narrative in the moments after the JFK assassination, pointing everybody in the direction of a lone gunman, and it was followed up by the Justice Department, the Assistant Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach writing a memo. It says the public must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone, that he didn't have Confederates that are still at large, and that he would have been convicted at trial. That became the marching orders LBJ repeated that verbiage almost identical when he created the Warren Commission, and that became the marching orders of the Warren Commission. Start with the conclusion, work backwards, eliminate all the distracting evidence that leads in other directions, and focus all your energies on Lee Harvey Oswald. That's exactly what they did. And that means everybody in the deep state conspiracy and all the mechanics, they all got away with it. Now, I would say that a lot of them paid ultimate price because in the process of preserving that narrative, keeping it under wraps as time went on, there were threats to it. There was a Jim Garrison trial down in New Orleans, which meant David Ferrie had part of the he was one of these mechanics. He was part of this deep state conspiracy. He had to be eliminated. Eladio Delgado had to be eliminated, right? Then we had the Watergate hearings in 72. Look at all the deaths that happened to some of these conspirators around Watergate when 5 of the 7 original Watergate burglars that were arrested that day turned out to be in Dallas also. When E. Howard Hunt, we learned what happened to E. Howard Hunt's wife, you know, and they had to be silenced. And then you go from Watergate to the church hearings in 75. And again, a bunch more people had to die to preserve the secret. And then you get to the House Select Committee hearings in 77, 78. A bunch more people had to die to preserve the secret. So in the end, it ends up getting everybody, including J. Edgar Hoover himself. When the CIA sort of double crossed him, they'd been working together throughout the 60s and all these different plots. And as long as J. Edgar Hoover worked with the CIA and gave it what it wanted, which was cover domestically, they were partners. But as soon as the prospect of Hoover not covering for a CIA mission to get rid of Nixon, they took him out too. There is no honor among thieves. So that's how the conspiracy worked. So back to the questions. Let's hopefully I've done in this 14-part FBI series an adequate job answering all these questions. But if I haven't to date, hopefully I can do that now. Regarding the presidential takedown number 1, which is JFK, how did the CIA get away with the domestic operation, which resulted in JFK assassination? And that is that the FBI covered for the CIA, as it had previously with Operation Chaos, which was basically the CIA's version of the FBI's COINTELPRO, because they had the same agenda: anti-communism, anti-civil rights, which means they had the same targets. And in the 60s, those targets would be JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Fred Hampton. And in the 70s, it'd be Nixon. And it's because they all fit in that category. They're either soft on communism or outright socialists or communists, or they're civil rights crusaders. They fit in one of those two categories, or in JFK's case, both. They become objects that need to be terminated, right? Because they're standing in the way of these objectives that these folks have. Question 2: how did Hoover's personal ambitions, his politics, and his connections contribute to the FBI's institutional motives to immunize the plotters in Dallas? Well, he had this unadulterated power ambition, and when he created the FBI, it was basically because he badgered the president and said, "We need more power. This department of investigation that we had before, we need to federalize it. This Bureau of Investigation, and we need to federalize it," which they did. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need the power to carry guns. We need the power to enforce laws across state lines. We need all these powers. He at first he sweet talked FDR and got what he wanted. When Truman didn't give it what he wanted, he learned that leaking and embarrassing the chief executive worked. And then when he gets Kennedy, he realizes none of that's going to work. He's going to have to blackmail him, extort what he needs. And so, he had nurtured a good relationship with FDR. He didn't have a great relationship with Truman. He obviously had a terrible relationship with JFK. He had a great relationship with Eisenhower and LBJ. LBJ was his best friend, and Nixon was part of that little sweet AF mafia with LBJ, Nixon, and Hoover. So they were fast friends. The only one in there he had a terrible relationship was JFK, and that's the one that ended up dead. And he was the one standing in the way, always trying to fire him. Right? His politics, he's anti-communist to the bone. He's anti-civil rights to the bone. which means he's going to uh, stand up as an enemy to a president who he feels is weak on communism. He's going to stand up against organizations who he believes are on the side of communists, such as these anti-Vietnam War protesters. He's going to stand up to the folks trying to change America culturally, these civil rights leaders. He's going to use COINTELPRO to do this. He's going to leak information to HUAC to go after these communist spies. So is it any wonder that FBI is going to have the same target list as their director? They're going to be direct reflections of each other. And then his connections to all these deep state politicians that we've mentioned before, LBJ, John Connally, Albert Thomas, Nixon, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these sweet business types, because he's in that group. When they meet, he's there. On the night before the assassination, when they met at Murchison's house, he was there. uh, he's got connections to intelligence, not just on his side, but on the CIA side. They've been working together, and he's got ties to all these organized crime figures. So much so because they have compromise on him that he runs around and tells everybody, oh, "Listen, there's no such thing as the mafia." Well, Frank Costello and Bibi Rebozo and Johnny Rosselli and Carlos Marcellus, Andros Tropicani, Sam Jean kind of running wild, right? Uh, but he, through his, because he's got this addiction to gambling on horses. And so he's using their racetracks, they're comping him and doing it willingly to keep a friend in the FBI director's seat. But at the same time, getting compromise on him, getting pictures of him and his homosexual friend, Clyde Tolson. So he's way over the bounds as far as the boundary is concerned of an appropriate relationship with a lot of these people. He's in their pocket, is what he is. So you take the ambition, the politics, and the connections of Hoover, and you just apply them to the FBI institutionally. As goes Hoover, so goes the FBI. Next question, are there indications that the FBI had foreknowledge? And we went through a long list. The FBI informants, which included Oswald himself, Ruby, Somerset, the guy that talked about the Miami plot after having a conversation, warned them, right? He was Vanderslice, who had a conversation with Ruby on the day of the JFK assassination. They had FBI wiretaps, which told them a lot of them came from these mafiosos who basically laid out how they were going to kill JFK. Richard Nagel, the letter Richard Nagel sent to Hoover, Guy Bannister, who is former FBI, is down there handling the Patsy, uh, the Newman building. They're right across the street from the Newman building, and all the activities that were going on there in the summer of '63. You'd have to believe that they were just so negligent, so as to ignore the nose right on their face, right in front of them. Warren DeBreeze, we saw how Warren DeBreeze was used, his FBI agent used in New Orleans to hide the identity of Chauncey Holt, who's standing right there next to Lee Harvey Oswald as he's leafleting. And the CIA was concerned because their asset, Chauncey Holt, was going to appear in a picture, probably in the newspaper someday. Here's the CIA asset standing right next to the Patsy. Now, they understood that that was just two CIA assets in that picture, but they were trying to set up Oswald Patsy, and that he had no connections to the CIA. It's going to be hard to make that case if he's standing right next to Chauncey Holt, one of theirs. So Warren DeBreeze, the FBI guy, hides the identity of Lee Harvey Oswald, misidentifies him intentionally, which means they have foreknowledge there's something going on with this Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, they've known there's something going on because Hoover himself wrote a memo in '60 when he was in Russia. Oswald said somebody down in Dallas is impersonating him. So they knew all the way back in '60 something was going on with Oswald. And then you have all these meetings between FBI informant Oswald and these FBI agents, John Quigley in New Orleans, James Hosty multiple times in Dallas, Nanny Lee Fenner, the FBI secretary who allegedly got the threatening letter from Oswald about blowing up the building or going after Hosty if he bothers his wife anymore. You have her story, which indicates they have foreknowledge, at least if that story is to be believed, that Oswald was a threat. Here you got the president coming within days, and you got this guy running around making threats to blow up things. So we know about the FBI telexes in different places. One in Chicago, one in New Orleans. Uh, the warning from the FBI informant Lee about the Chicago plot. The story from Nestor Castellanos about they're going to kill Oswald and come, or they're going to kill Kennedy, and when they do, they're going to come into a bunch of money and be able to buy all these weapons to go get Castro. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on and on. How about Hosty after the assassination, uh, saying a little bit too much when he's talking to Lieutenant Jack Revel from Dallas Police, saying, "Yeah, we knew all along he was here." Talk about Oswald. He's this communist. He was in our files. Blah blah blah. And of course, FBI Director Hoover disavowed that statement, but it happened. Yeah, Revel had witnesses with it. I could go on. Okay, there's just a lot of foreknowledge the FBI had, and you put it all together, maybe one or two things in isolation, you say, well, everybody's human. They might have not communicated with each other. Not the left hand didn't communicate to the right hand, whatever. No, when you start putting all this together, you realize they had all this foreknowledge because they were playing along. They were covering. Next question: how did the FBI control the narrative out of Dallas? Well, it starts with Hoover. Comes right out and announces it. Makes a phone call to Bobby. Announces it to in a memo to the FBI, tells LBJ. LBJ passes it on to the Situation Room, to the White House. And the next thing you know, the Justice Department in an Air Office memo is communicating the same. And eventually, the Warren Commission basically parrots what started in the mouth of J. Edgar Hoover back on the day of the assassination. That's how you set the narrative or control the narrative. And then you move the investigation out of the state, out of the city of Dallas, out of the state of Texas to Washington. You're in charge of it, which means you control all the evidence. And 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 then you funnel all your evidence that backs up your director's original statement. You funnel all that evidence to the Warren Commission, excluding carefully any exculpatory evidence that might not point in that direction of Lee Harvey Oswald. So that's how you control the narrative out of Dallas. Next question: how did the FBI control the investigation after Dallas? Well, the Warren Commission only examined evidence provided by the FBI. That's a pretty good way to control the investigation. And then they had their inside man on the Warren Commission who helped steer it from the inside with the help of Alan Dulles, protecting the CIA. Next question: how did the FBI handle evidence? Well, it was pretty one-sided. All the incriminating evidence pointing in the direction of the lone gunman narrative uh, made it into the Warren Commission. And we find out a lot of it was manufactured. Some of it was planted. It was manipulated and eventually forwarded to the Warren Commission. Uh, it, a lot of it was altered and changed, forged signatures, changing statements. Uh, you know, the exculpatory evidence pointing in the direction of conspiracy, that evidence never saw it, never made it off the cutting room floor, right? It never got presented to the Warren Commission. It was destroyed, it was altered, changed, it was suppressed. Witnesses were intimidated. So in 64, when the Warren Commission issues its report, it's basing its report. It'd be like going to trial, and all you did was listen to the prosecution. And the defense never got a chance to rebut anything. So all the evidence was the incriminating type. So that's the story that the American people. And over time, the truth starts to come out. But the trial's already over. Oswald's already dead. And he's been tried and convicted in the eyes of the American people. It's in all the history books. It's in all the movies. It's become sort of it's hardened into fact, established fact now. That's a hard thing to go back and unwind after the fact. That's why the CIA created the term conspiracy theorist, to try to use a pejorative term to smear people who are trying to go back and unwind and get to the truth. I don't want anybody to unwind it, get to the truth. All right, next question. How were FBI loose ends dealt with? Well, they were discredited, they were threatened, they were drugged, and most of them were killed, most, including their own. Next question. What payoffs were only possible? All right, we just went through all the payoffs. I don't have to repeat that. A lot of payoffs to a lot of people. Now, how about the presidential takedown number two, which is Watergate? Here we are, uh, Kennedy in 63, Watergate in 72, 9 years apart, but so many of the uh, the methods were similar. It was a template. So how did the FBI participate in this? Well, they covered for the CIA again by directing the investigation away from the CIA towards the White House, towards Nixon. How'd they do that? They had a they once Hoover was removed, the guy in charge of the investigation was no longer Hoover, who would have protected Nixon. It was now Mark Felt, who was part of the pointing, aiming all the investigation at the White House and Nixon. He's the source, right? Deep throat to Bob Woodward, another intelligence asset, writing for the Washington Post. Uh, I think he had two sources: Alexander Haig inside the White House, and and Mark Felt inside the FBI, and together uh, they pushed along the investigation. Their mouthpiece was Woodward, and uh, CIA was completely immunized by the FBI, the way they handled that investigation. And then they had their inside man on the Warren Commission who uh, had covered up in 63 and 64. Now he ends up getting appointed to replace Richard Nixon. He's the replacement. And because he's covered up once, he's going to cover up again, right? They know that. And what's the cover up this time? You pardon Richard Nixon 30 days after you take office, which prevents all trials going forward, civil, criminal, his resignation prevented an impeachment trial, and then the pardon prevented a civil or criminal trial afterwards. And there you go. Immunity has been preserved. And it was all the workings of the FBI. Last question. How did FBI begin losing control of the narratives? We talked about this yesterday. I went through a bunch of evidence that emerged between 63 and 64 and the late 70s. And a lot of it emerged because of investigations that kept uncovering links back to JFK. The Jim Garrison in 68, the Watergate in 72, 73, 74, House Select, the church hearings in 75, House Select in 78, Liberty Lobby into the 80s and later. Then you had in 91, you have Oliver Stone's JFK movie, which leads to the AARB, the release of documents that were previously classified, independent researchers, internet, all of this coming out and books being written and documentaries, et cetera, et cetera. And here we are 62, 63 odd years later, and you can look back and you can see, because you're not so close to the forest now, you can see the trees and you can see the patterns repeated and repeated. It's like a washing machine, rinse and repeat. The same pattern that killed JFK took out the obstacle to these deep state uh, profit motives, this profit margin there, is the same in the fact that he'd become an enemy to the deep state agenda, which is anti-communism and anti-civil rights. It gets repeated in 65 with the elimination of a civil rights icon who was quickly becoming a human rights icon, not just here domestically, but internationally. They take out Malcolm X. And then in 68, too, Martin Luther King, who's quickly transitioning from just a civil rights leader to now a presidential candidate, somebody who is representing uh, poor whites just as much as he's representing blacks because of the Vietnam War. And his constituency is growing and growing by the day. His influence is growing. He's a threat. RFK running for president keeps saying he's going to reopen the JFK assassination. He's one of his top policy objectives was civil rights. And of course, he was going to end the Vietnam War. Like he was the anti-war candidate. He's a threat in multiple ways. Primarily, obviously the civil rights and ending the war, but the reopening of the JFK assassination, and with the knowledge that he brought to the table as having been the attorney general prior, and it was his brother, he knew the insides. He was a threat. So then in 69, Fred Hampton, the next great, the Black Messiah to come along. He's a threat. He opposed the war, promoted civil rights. He's a threat. What was he doing that was so troublesome in Chicago? He's trying to make peace between all these ethnic groups that were fighting in the streets. Again, all these guys are for peace. JFK, no Vietnam War, no war in Cuba. Malcolm X, He started off as a man of violence, but he transitioned to a man of unity, brotherhood, and peace. And that became his message. That's when he died. He wasn't a threat when he was a man of violence. He was useful. Keep everybody stirred up and angry against each other. MLK, nonviolent, non-cooperation, a man of peace. RFK, and the Vietnam War, a man of peace. Fred Hampton, trying to make peace in the streets of Chicago. And then you get to Watergate, and you got a guy who's a reliable cold warrior who's done a complete 180. Now he's trying to what? Make peace with the Soviets, with the Chinese, travels to both places. Détente, SALT I treaties, right? Or continuing the tradition of JFK and trying to disarm nuclear weapons. Uh, he's a threat. And the tactics, the methods, the patterns, the infiltration, the use of informants and uh, rat fucking you, destroying their organizations from within, spying on them from within. And well, I don't want to relitigate all of it, but you can see why they begin losing control of the narrative. The truth, you can go to the well once too often. You know, if you'd stopped in 63 with JFK and none of these other assassinations or overthrows of the government none of these acts of treason had happened subsequent, maybe people would just chalk it up to a one-off. But then you start seeing the repeat, repeat, repeat. You're like, hey, this is not the work of these lone nuts that are just randomly popping up here and there, taking out these people. There's something about, I was watching a cop movie the other night, and there was a serial killer on the loose. And the way that they solved the crime was to look at the victims and try to figure out what common traits that they had or common characteristics or something that they had in common, that the serial killer was picking them out, choosing them as targets. That's just investigative technique, tactic 101, right? And all these people that are victims in this list here share the same common characteristics. So then you have to look at who those questions in that JFK movie are perfect. Why were they killed? That's the common characteristics. Who benefited, and then who had the power to cover it up? We just went through who benefited, the payoffs. And then who has the power to cover up? Well, when you're in the government and you have control over the judicial system, and you're in the government, you have control of the FBI and the investigation, and you're in the government, you can appoint the Warren Commission, or you control who gets investigated, who doesn't. You control who gets labeled the culprit and who gets off, who gets immunized, who gets covered. So I could, if you get me going on that topic, I could go and go and go. So I won't. I'll move on. This Cold War era deep state, this conspiracy, I divide into tiers, different levels. I put at the top the industries that fed the national security apparatus. And right at the top is H.L. Hunt. We talked about how his number two, John Currington, wrote a book here recently about how he was assigned by his boss Hunt to pay off in three very high profile cases: JFK, MLK, and RFK, the attorneys to get the patsies. Well, the first one, they just killed the guy. They killed the killer, right? Oswald. Their guy Ruby got a big payoff. They killed him. And then the MLK, they paid off the attorney, and the patsy pled guilty. And then the RFK, they paid off the attorney, and the patsy ends up confessing. That money came right from H.L. Hunt. This is blood money. This is how you cover. No doubt, these same people paid for all of the conspiracy and the mechanics and everything needed to carry out the hits. But then afterwards, their money covered the cover up. And so I named some names. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is a list I think pertains especially to the JFK assassination, specifically to the JFK assassination. You got Hunt, Murchison, Richardson, Byrd, and their companies. And you got George and Herman Brown, who run Brown and Root. You got Billy Celestis, who ran the equipment service. He was LBJ's business partner in Pecos, Texas. William Pauley, whose best friend was Alan Dulles, CIA director, former CIA director, ran the Miami bus company, ran all of the public transportation in Havana, Cuba, and had business interests in the gas companies there. He was part of the Sweet AF group. And this is a big money guy. We know that it was on his yacht that the S Force made several, last ditch efforts to assassinate Castro and embarrass Kennedy. So we know General Dynamics, General Motors, Bell Helicopter, Brown Brothers, Harriman, Sullivan, and Crown. These are all companies and entities, private sector, that benefited or stood to benefit and were part of Sweet AF in some cases. For JFK to be removed and replaced by LBJ, and his first official act would be to greenlight the Vietnam War. So it's not just blood money and the respect that they had JFK killed to remove the obstacle to fire him, but it was blood money because the policy change was from no war to the Vietnam War. 57,000 Americans died as a result of that policy change. That is, the blood of those 57,000 men are on the hands of these people who paid for that policy change. That's tier one. Tier two is the national security apparatus itself. These are all the governmental actors who can carry out a conspiracy such as this, organize it, plan it. They have access to the the mechanics that they need to their contacts, and then they can immunize everybody afterwards. And so you got the CIA involved in, I believe, in the JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, RFK, and Nixon. So that's five of the six. FBI was involved in JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, Fred Hampton, Nixon. Five of the six. LBJ was involved in JFK, MLK, RFK. Three of the six. And in the JFK case, he was the immunity, right? And MLK and RFK, it was his government. Now he was the president at this point. It was his government that I believe took those two people out. Now, these were his avowed enemies. You think about in '68, the Vietnam War chased him out of the White House. And who were the two loudest anti-Vietnam War voices at that time? MLK and RFK. And who was his best friend? Who's in charge of the FBI? J. Edgar Hoover, who was involved in both of those. Secret Service was involved in JFK and Nixon. You say, well, how was Secret Service involved in Nixon? Well, they ran all the taping system, and they were infiltrated by the CIA, and the tapes became the cudgel, the leverage instrument by which they forced Nixon out of office. And then the Pentagon was involved in JFK and Nixon. JFK, they it was the corrupt autopsy and the fact that they wanted that war. Nixon, it was the Moore Radford affair where they were actually spying on Nixon. That's what got Nixon all fired up to create the plumbers to begin with. And my goodness, so they're the tier two conspirators. And then you have tier three, which are the useful instruments. I don't put them in the same category. These are the folks who get their hands dirty. They carry out all the plans. You got your local police, Dallas, New York, Memphis, LA, Chicago with Fred Hampton. And then you got your organized crime figures involved in all these different plots, the JFK, MLK, RFK, Nixon. And then you got the anti-Castro Cubans, which are involved in JFK and Nixon. Four of the five burglars were Cubans at Watergate. So they're used because of their special skills. Just to give you a quick example, like the organized crime is very good at silencing witnesses afterwards. So that is one of their uses in these conspiracies. They have others. Or anti-Castro Cubans, as I mentioned earlier, were trained by the CIA. So it was the S Force. It was all Santos Traficantes people. They were all Cubans. They happened to be organized crime as well. And they were trained how to carry out a long distance hit on a moving target with high power rifles and scopes. That's Dallas. That's JFK. All right. As far as Nixon is concerned, as I mentioned, four of the five burglars were Cubans. They're the useful instruments. They're CIA trained. So the transition from treachery to treason, which is an interesting topic to me, because when you see the beginning of this deep state. And its formation, its earliest years, 1860s to 1914. This is the post-Civil War, pre-World War One era. And here, during this era, you see a cooperation, private and public sectors. Why? Because the desire for overseas expansion by these new corporations that are becoming these monsters, and they want to increase their profits, and they see, uh, you know, resources overseas, they see markets overseas, they see a chance to expand and grow their their business empire. But we've got to colonize these places. We got to take control of these places and overthrow the local governments and replace them with our own people so that we can have these friendly relationships. That's going to necessarily involve the government. You're going to have to use the Marines, for example, to enforce your change. Like in Japan, 1854. Yeah, and this predates by a few years, but this is the first time that you see the use of the military to go in and force Japan to sign a deal that they didn't want to sign, a trade agreement. And we learned a lesson through that. And that was, when you have a hammer like the United States Navy and you go park it off the coast of Japan, you say you're going to, it's like that scene from the Godfather when the lawyer shows up and tells the movie director, one of two things is going to be on this contract, either your signature or your brains. You make them a deal that they can't refuse. And so then we buy Alaska. And this didn't require us to come in with the military and force our way because we made a legitimate purchase. But it was a purchase that benefited our corporate interest and because Alaska, as it has proven to be, is just chock full of natural resources. And then Latin America in 1889, excuse me, we at a Pan American conference, we tell them we're going to build a highway that connects all the way up from Canada all the way down through into Latin America so we can have free trade back and forth. Really, it was about getting resources up from South America into America for our industries, and then we turn around and send our goods back down to and sell, increase our markets. And we were the behemoth in the north. We just told them we're going to do this. Hawaii, we the sugar cane was really necessary, obviously, to the sugar industry. And it was a very lucrative industry. And when the Queen started raising the price of our being able to have access to their sugar cane, we just went in with the Marines and we overthrew our government. We took control of Hawaii and eventually swallowed it up, became part of the United States. We tried to do the same thing in Cuba, and the Cubans were resistant. They said, we saw what you did in Hawaii, and now you want us for the same reason, sugar cane. And so we ginned up a war, and the public, the propaganda, uh, which was carried out by our yellow press, this press that was basically controlled by these uh, deep state corporate interests who wanted Cuba for the same reasons these corporations wanted Cuba, which was it was going to increase our, we're going to have all these resources that we need, new markets, et cetera, et cetera. So they start writing about how Spain is mistreating their colony, the Cubans, and we need to go in and help the Cubans. And so the American people, I think if you'd have done a poll in the late 1800s, they said the Spanish-American War is a war of for human rights. We're trying to uh, go in and help the Cubans. Really, it was about taking over Cuba. And so the propaganda was carried out. This is always when these operations, we started to learn a method by which, we've never fought a foreign war before. And here we got to convince the American people this war is worth it. So you begin with the propaganda and you soften up the American people. Then you run a psyop against the American people now that you've got the press on your side. And the psyop in this case was the Delome letter, which allegedly was written by the foreign minister of Spain calling our president, McKinley, a weak and stupid politician. And that gets everybody fired up with this patriotic zeal. How dare he say that about our president? And then we have a false flag. And in this case, it was remember the Maine. We blow up our own ship. We kill our own sailors. We blame it on the Spanish. Next thing you know, we're at war. Watch that formula be repeated over and over and over again going forward. Same method. Uh, so then we end up at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War when the Cubans are like resistant to us creating another, making them into a state. So they resist, and we end up not being able to do to Cuba exactly what we did to Hawaii, but we do get access to Cuba. But we tried to colonize the Philippines. They resisted. We end up in an insurrection battle over there. And and then China, the open door note, which we're informing the rest of the world that we have as much right in China to open trade relations with China as any other country. And this, you can see, it's happening rapidly. For a long time, for 100 years, we tried to stay out of the world's business. Old Monroe Doctrine. You stay out of our affairs, we'll stay out of yours. And all of a sudden, with the rise of corporations and the demand for overseas markets, demand for resources, and all these efforts to make more money, we these private sector interests cooperate with the public sector to start colonizing, and that's the age of imperialism. And then you get to the election of 1900. This is a seminal moment because there the American people had a chance to speak with a voice and say, we don't like this new direction. We want to go back and leave the rest of the world alone if they'll leave us alone. But instead, you had a real clear line of distinction between the two candidates, right? McKinley was pro-imperialism. His vice president was Teddy Roosevelt. He was pro-imperialism. On the flip side, you have William Jennings Bryan, who's anti-imperialism. And here's a chance for the American people to either, it's going to determine the direction we go. This is a very key election. By choosing McKinley and Roosevelt, the American people effectively gave this overseas expansion effort, colonization effort, age of imperialism, its blessing. And what you see next, after McKinley gets assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt takes over. We had this issue with Colombia over Panama. We dig the Panama Canal. We basically go in and, enforce our will in that region to build this canal. And it was for our benefit, right? We said it was about national security, we had a one ocean navy, get it from the Atlantic to the Pacific back and forth, but really it's about trade. And then Roosevelt was the one who told the Russians and the Japanese to end their war. He gets a Nobel Peace Prize for it. Why? Because they're fighting over China. And China is, after 1899, the open door note, we want access to China. Russia wants access to China. Japan wants access and control over China. And we effectively ended the Russo-Japanese War so that we could be the final say-so in China instead of the Russians and the Japanese. And we said it was for the Chinese benefit, but it really is for trade purposes. We saw potential in that Chinese market in 1904, which continues to this day. They've become our number one trade partner, right? It didn't happen 20 years ago, 40 years ago. It started in 1904. And in 1907, again, over the issue of China, Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet around Japan just to run rings around to intimidate Japan and let them know we can reach out and touch you anytime we want. If you make one wrong move with respect to China, we are the guarantors of Chinese freedom now. We are responsible for China now. Not you, not the Chinese. We are. So this all was motivated by private sector desire to make more money, but it only happened, or it was only accomplished through the cooperation of the public sector because GM doesn't have a Great White Fleet. The sugar companies can't threaten Colombia with a war with our Navy if they don't give us the rights to the Panama Canal. On and on it goes. So they have to work together. That's where all this began. Then World War I begins, and you see a consolidation of the private and public sector. They've cooperated before, but they were still separate entities. Now they're consolidating, and you see the method get repeated. We weren't in World War I, but everybody wanted us in to help the Allied side. So especially the British. They cut our cable. So it means now we're getting propagandized through Britain. We don't know what's going on over in Europe except what Britain tells us. Of course, Britain's going to slant the news in a direction that uh, creates a propaganda value to them. So we'll join their side, right? We had a lot of immigrants from both sides. So we got to tip the scale a little bit. So we'll support the Allied side. And then the PSYOP was the Zimmerman note, where again, we get this note that's never been produced. We've never seen it, but the government says that the media says, actually, it was Britain who said they intercepted it, and they sent it through our yellow press. And we read the Zimmerman note, which is the German foreign minister allegedly making a deal with Mexico. If you'll help us fight America, we'll give you Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, California back, etc. And we're furious, right? That's the psyop on the American people. And then right on the heels of that, boom, the Lusitania, which is a British ship, but it's full of Americans going back and forth between New York and England. And it's loaded down with all sorts of war materials, which is a violation. And Germans said they would sink any ship coming to England or back and forth that had war materials on it. And they had warned any ship, any traffic going back and forth between America, because they knew we were cheating. We're flying neutral countries' flags over ships fully loaded down with war materials, right? Uh, Contraband. And so they sunk it. We sent that ship intentionally in a harm's way. The Germans sunk it. We knew with the death of all those Americans, the British knew, we knew the propaganda value that would be. And sure enough, right on the heels of that, we enter the war. Same that the propaganda followed by the PSYOP, followed by the false flag. And then here you have Wilson. This is the consolidation. Wilson requests all these best and brightest of the private sector to come into the public sector and help run the wartime economy because they do it so well in the private sector. We need your help. And with them comes this ultravires doctrine. And at the conclusion of World War One, you start to see the wheels turning in these folks' heads. Wow, look what was accomplished. We have a complete new world order as a result of this. The United States is top dog now. We've always been we were just in the band before. Now we're the leader of the band. We've gone from we're the largest creditor nation in the world. Everybody owes us money. The world's financial capital has moved across the ocean from London to New York City. We're the only company that has any money. And then all these companies during World War I made all this money and created this new business model. As I said, boy, if we ever get in a situation like this again, we have to arrange it such that the war never ends. We don't need the war to end. There's too much money to be made. After the war, the Senate looked into these war profits. And in Senate document 259, they say, quote, profits under 25%, talk about companies, were exceptional. That was that was the exception. For instance, the coal companies made between 100% and 7,856% on their capital stock during the war. The Chicago Packers doubled and tripled their earnings. And let us not forget, the bankers who financed the Great War. If anyone had the cream of the profits, it was the bankers. These are these deep state guys, and the light bulb has gone off. We made so much money when our corporations were just beginning here at home, and then we overseas expanded and made a bunch more money. And now with this war, the profits dwarf what we've ever made before. The Senate Night Committee said World War I profits exceeded 300%, 600%, and in some cases 1,600%. They calculated $16 billion in war profits. So what you end up with is this new unaccountable, unelected deep state oligarchy, these few men running everything, because it's 50 or 60 men who literally owned all the corporations. They'd sit on each other's boards. They'd hide behind shell companies and subsidiaries, but it's the same 50, 60 men running everything. And since they have all the money and they're running all the corporations, that means they are literally running the entire U.S. economy. And if they're running the U.S. economy because of their money, which gives them power and influence and access, they are literally running the U.S. government. The same 50 to 60 people running the corporations, the U.S. economy, and the U.S. government. That's the beginning of the consolidation between private and public. The operating principle now in both is ultravires. It's this oligarchy of 50 or 60 men running everything. And their new business model is war. So then you get to the interwar years, 1919, 1941, which is a confederation of private public sectors where they become like a government. Uh, it's not got a constitution. It's not uh, got a constituency necessarily. It's just these 50, 60 guys working with the public sector, running everything. And it's like they are the government, but they're completely in the shadows, unaccountable, unelected. And that's when you see this plot against FDR called the business plot, because he dares help. He ran on a New Deal to help the unemployed person, to help the poor people, right? And that would mean necessarily a shift of wealth from these 50 to 60 uh, down to the little people. And they said, no, 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 no. This was the first, this isn't the first time we see treason. I mean, we saw treason when they uh, betrayed the American people into the Spanish-American War with a false flag. We see treason again when they betrayed the American people into World War One with another false flag and these psyops. That's treason. People died. But here we see treason again where they actually try to take out the government. Not literally kill the king, but figuratively kill the king. Later, it'll become literal. We see the oligarchy financing overseas Hitler's rise to power and facilitated through the investment firm in New York, Brown Brothers Harriman, and protected legally by the legal firm of uh, Sullivan and Cromwell. By the way, it wasn't just Brown Brothers Harriman; it was Union Banking Corporation, which that's where Prescott Bush was. He was very involved. That's the beginning of the Bush dynasty, right? They are committing treason in their own right by rebuilding and rearming Germany, which was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. They're doing it anyway. Why? Because it will provide a buffer against the Soviets, which are the expansion of communist Russia, right? The In order to facilitate this going forward, the deep state oligarchy thought, we should run a psyop against our own people and create a red scare where the American people are so terrified of communist expansion. We'll run around saying things better dead than red. We'll have, uh, you know, we're going to warn about all these immigrants coming over from these Eastern European countries with these communist roots and how they are really closet communists come over here to infiltrate, spy, and overthrow our own government. So that results in things like Palmer raids and the Sacco and Vanzetti story, where we're targeting these immigrants from these places where socialism and communism is is the way of life. And we're able to do that because this Red Scare is not just political and social, it's also economic. After World War One, when the economy shrunk after the war, we had post-war inflation and deflation at the same time. Inflation because the money wasn't worth any. Uh, well, what happened was, these products that weren't being made for peacetime, they were being made for war, but nobody needs to go to Walmart and buy a tank, right? And during peacetime, they need consumer goods, but there weren't any consumer goods. There was a period of transition there where it took time to catch up. There was a lag effect, and so during that period, people had money, but it wasn't. There was no products to buy or any products to buy. And then there are other situations like farmers where you had uh, uh, you'd been making all these huge profits during World War One, and all of a sudden the demand goes down after the war because you're not feeding the whole world anymore. And so now you can't sell your product, and so you have all these crops sitting around, and you're losing your farm. You can't pay your loans. So we have a situation where we have inflation, where money is worthless. We have a lot of it, but it's not worth the paper it's written. And deflation, where you try to find in an economic model a balance, a sweet spot between inflation and deflation. And we had simultaneously both inflation and deflation after World War One. And so a lot of people are unemployed. Farmers are losing their farms. We have labor unrest. due in part to all these immigrants taking these jobs. And so some of the folks that are unemployed are looking at people that are immigrants recent getting the jobs because they'll take less pay. We have a lot of issues in the interwar years in America, which conveniently the deep state was able to create this red scare that combined the economic tensions, combined the political issues and the social, all these things into one big basket. And folks and this became this fear, this irrational fear of anything red, anything communist, became the impetus for everything that was to come later. You know, uh, it's been hardwired. It's almost like in our DNA now. It's been such a successful sales job by these folks to be scared of Russia in particular, the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, because these commie bastards are going to come and take us over. And that becomes the justification, the rationalization, the reason for us to always be on this war footing, which is the point, because a war footing means uh, a wartime economy, essentially. And it means these big industries are continuing to make these profits as if we're always at war. But you got to keep the people stoked up and afraid of a boogeyman, and the boogeyman is red. Then you get to World War II, and here we have the same method, the same template, the propaganda. The British cut the transatlantic cable again, which means we're getting all the news filtered through them. And then the PSYOP was the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, where we feigned surprise when we had broken the code. We knew they were coming, but we let the attack happen so as to galvanize the American people who had previously been against joining another European war to now saying, yes, let's join in this burst of patriotism. The false flag was, therefore, Pearl Harbor. We didn't have to actually do anything. We just let it happen. And it acts as a false flag. And the confederacy of private and public sectors was when President Roosevelt again asks the private sector, best and brightest, to join and help run the wartime economy. And that forever systematized ultravires as the operating principle, not just for the private sector, but public sector as well. And from then on, that's how we've operated. And of course, just like in World War I, which was a sort of a tune-up, a warm-up for the main act, which was World War II, war is a racket. Defense spending went way up. For the first time, we started deficit spending, borrowing money, creating a debt, a deficit. We uh, Before we actually got into the war, we were spending a whole bunch of money through Lend-Lease, trying to help our allies in Britain. We launched an enormous project back home in America called the Manhattan Project, which was right on the heels of the TVA. And Wall Street investment increased, corporate profits went up through the roof. And as a result, when we entered World War II, we were in the thick of a Great Depression. When we exited World War II, we were uh, the Great Depression was a thing of the past. And it became like World War I taught us the new business model. World War II said, not only is it a war a way to make money, war is a way to cure depression or recession or economic downturn. And so they didn't let this war end. Before the war even ended in World War II, the deep state was already stoking the next war, which is the Cold War. Why? To preserve the business model going forward and to foreclose on any future Great Depressions. And so you see Alan Dulles over there, who's this Sullivan and Cromwell guy representing all these companies, but he's also the OSS director in Switzerland, and he's negotiating secretly with the Germans, Operation Sunrise, pulling out key German through Operation Paperclip, sending home to America that can help us in the future war against communists, scientists, right, nuclear physicists, folks that had experience with chemical and biological weapons, doctors who had all this medical knowledge because they've been experimenting on live human beings, the concentration camps. military spies, folks of in intelligence backgrounds, all stoking the next war against the Soviets. So that's when the then we get into this from 46 to 91, this deep states running our country in this era of the Cold War. And it's 46, 47, 45, 46, whatever years of continual war footing, several proxy wars, all maintained by a Red Scare against the Soviets. We're taught from a very young age to fear the Soviet Leviathan, right? We have, it's just I remember when I was a little kid, we practiced jumping up under, the alarm would go off at school. We'd hide under our desk, put our heads between our hands and knees in the event of a nuclear attack by the Soviets. It never ended. We had a Cuban Missile Crisis in there. It was it became a way of life. Everyone's looking to the sky. When are the missiles going to start raining down on us? And I'm sure they were being taught the same thing. And this is all in an effort to gin up fear. It's a psyop. They run against the American people to gin up fear, to pay tax dollars to support this machine that ultimately is benefiting these 50 or 60 plutocrats that are running this plutocracy of these deep state oligarchs that are running this uh, deep state, which remember I defined as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. That's the beast that we're feeding to keep us safe. It's all about safety. And so you see during this era, uh, the CIA being given power of covert ops, the 5412 committee, and then you just see a whole series of operations, ostensibly under the guise of stopping the spread of communism, right? Operation Mockingbird came first. I don't think that's a coincidence. That's about controlling the press, which means that's about propagandizing the American people. All these psyops, all the methods started with a yellow press or propaganda that sort of primed the pump and brought the American people along, uh, educating them in the propaganda techniques, right? Convincing the population that this was all necessary. So you have to start with Operation Mockingbird, where you take over and control all the media, and you filter your message. You keep priming the pump of the Red Scare, and you filter this message to the American people. It just becomes a drumbeat every day, every day. No matter what you watch on TV, you listen to on the radio, you read the newspaper. Today, it's the internet. It's in your textbooks, it's in your history books, it's in the movies, everywhere you look. Red Scare, Red Scare, Red Scare. Uh, that was the CIA. The FBI ran the HUAC hearings, going after the spy Alger Hiss. That was in the news every day. CIA ran Operation MK Ultra, trying to figure out a way they could create these assets that would do things against their own will, have no memory of them afterwards. You use LSD, you use hypnosis, and you create these assets that'll actually carry out assassinations for you if need be. That was a that was an operation against the American people. See, the Operation Mockingbird was an operation against the American people, propagandizing the American people. Operation MK Ultra started off using uh, Korean War prisoners of war, then Vietnamese citizens during the Vietnam War, but eventually American citizens to break people's brains, to create little automatons who will do whatever the CIA wants them to do. A domestic operation targeting American citizens. Operation Zapata was the operation to overthrow Castro. Again, we can't have a communist government 90 miles off the coast of Florida. That was the Bay of Pigs. Then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And then we have the CIA Operation Red Cross, a last-ditch effort to take out Castro on William Pauly's yacht with the S-Force. In direct against the direct orders of the commander in chief, who said, "We're done with that. Not doing that." They did it anyway. Treason. Then you have ZR Rifle in Northwoods in Dallas, which is the overthrow of our government via the killing of the king. It's a CIA operation covered by the FBI. And then you have the Warren Commission, which is a joint CIA FBI operation to use the Warren Commission to cover or provide immunity for ZR Rifle and Northwoods and everything happened in Dallas. Then you have the Gulf of Tonkin, which is another false flag to get us into the Vietnam War. Starts with propaganda, then the PSYOP, and the false flag. Same nothing. During this time, you have COINTELPRO by the FBI, which is targeting American citizens, all in the name of anti-communism, anti-civil rights. And COINTELPRO is directly responsible for the assassinations of Malcolm X, MLK, and Fred Hampton. At the same time, the CIA and FBI are both going after Jim Garrison because he is a threat, that Clay Shaw trial is a threat to the narrative that emerged after Dallas in 63. And they have this Garrison group. They're infiltrating and rat fucking from within. Why? Because, again, they can't allow the American people to know the truth. CIA Operation MK Ultra was a direct, became the operation that ultimately ended in the assassination of RFK. CIA Operation Chaos was an operation that ultimately resulted in the Charles Manson murders, which they said was to create a race war and discredit the civil rights leaders and organization. And then you get to FBI and CIA both cooperating, covering for each other in the Watergate scandal to get rid of another president who represented a threat to the Cold War money spigot. So you go through this long list, and then ultimately you get to the House Select Committee in the late 70s, and here's another threat to the Dallas narrative. And so they infiltrate, the CIA infiltrates House Select Committee with their own guy. He becomes the liaison. All the evidence that the House Select Committee requested from the CIA had to come through George Jonees. And we find out George Jonees was one of the guys running in charge of the anti-Castro stuff down in Miami that was very much involved with Lee Harvey Oswald. In other words, he knows from the inside what documents to produce and what documents not to produce to the House Select Committee. How to protect, again, the CIA. He is the House Select Committee version of Allen Dulles and the Warren Commission. The CIA informant or the CIA infiltrator is going to, from the inside, protect the CIA. So you see, as a result of this continuing 45, 46-year running Cold War scare, all these intelligence operations by the FBI and the CIA targeting American citizens. And what's the main goal of all these operations? Is to protect themselves against the American people learning the truth. That's why you propagandize. That's why you use COINTELPRO and chaos to go after civil rights organizations and anti-war protesters, to discredit them, to protect you, to give you more power, to justify, legitimize this Cold War Red Scare and all of these operations to stop the expansion of communism. I mean, it's all tied together. It's all part of the same fabric of the same quilt. And behind the scenes are these 50 or 60 deep state. It's more than that now. But it's this national security apparatus and all these industries that feed it that say we need continual war. That's the business model. Not only does it make us money, it prevents a Great Depression. We are now dependent on it. There was a time when we weren't dependent on it. It was just something new to try because there's such fantastic profits to be made. Now we're dependent on it. It has to be maintained. And so that forces them to scare the public. And so they use propaganda, but they gin up these fake controversies, these fake race wars through Operation Chaos, these fake civil rights, leaders trying to take over the government. So we try to discredit them, and we ultimately assassinate them, and we find patsies to divide these civil rights organizations, get them warring against each other. It's all about destroying the information that the American people are getting, corrupting it, infiltrating it, rat fucking it. So the American people are so confused, they're fearful. And they look to these people to keep them safe. We look to them to keep us safe. And we buy pretty much every lie they sell us. And in exchange for safety and in exchange for protection, we let them run all these operations. We let them do all these illegal things. And folks that stand up and call it out for what it is become obstacles. They become targets and they end up dying. That's how treachery becomes treason. Now, I told you that uh, the deep state has changed forms, right? There's been a progression in the post-Civil War to the World War II era. It was about building these overseas empires, expanding, getting access to the markets, getting access to the resources, learning this new business model, and then World War II protecting it. Then you get into the Cold War, and it's about continuing this new business model via a Red Scare that creates a permanent war footing. That's the 45, 46 years of Cold War. And that's when the national security apparatus becomes a permanent way. It used to be it would rise and fall depending upon peacetime and wartime. Now it's a continual thing. It never ends. And the industries that feed it never have to stop feeding it, which means they're constantly making money. And they're both, and it's operating as one now. It's not a private sector, public sector. They're one. It's one sector. It's all about maximizing profits, uh, their private interests. An example of that be the Vietnam War. That was in both of their interests to make happen because it was going to make so much money. And you minimize the public interest. In the case of JFK, for example, the public interest was National Security Action Memo 263, which was for Kennedy's way of saying we're not going to have a Vietnam War. It's their war. Let them figure it out. It's a civil war. It's not for us to so he was essentially saying there's not going to be a Vietnam War. He's representing the public interest. Their private interest is a war for money's sake. He's saying, no, we're not going to fight a war for money's sake. So what do? You eliminate that public interest advocate, which is the JFK assassination. Then you immunize yourself through the Warren Commission. That's just one case where ultravires operating principle came into play and was carried out methodically, step by step by step, so as to get back to the original objective, which is to make money. Through what? War. So the treason during this Cold War era, deep state was a couple of examples. You saw talk about when did they aid to abet the enemy? How about Operation Sunrise? These are war criminals. They're supposed to go to Nuremberg. And Dulles, representing Sullivan Cromwell and the business interests that want a secret surrender from these guys so as to protect all their assets over there, these business assets that built up during the interwar years. A little treason is a small price to pay to protect our business assets, right? Aiding and abetting the enemy. How about betraying a country? Remember the Maine, Lusitania, Pearl Harbor. These are betray the country into wars when these events were contrived. There are false flags. People died in these wars, overthrowing the government. How about the business plot when they tried to overthrow FDR? Killing the king. How about the JFK assassination when they did overthrow the government by killing the king? Those are all just examples of treason. Today, I wouldn't categorize the deep state or I wouldn't define it the same way. It's still the national security apparatus and industries that feed it, but now it's grown to include the federal bureaucracy and the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that support it. And we're finding out here in the last year or so, we find out how big this network is, how much money is at stake, and how corrupt they are, and how foreign countries, in a lot of cases, are controlling these NGOs. Foreign interests are spending U.S. tax dollars for their own benefits. That's the contemporary deep state. It's a leviathan. And when Elon Musk, for example, tried to go in with Doge and cut it all off, you saw the outcry. And what's the ultravires in this contemporary deep state? It's about maximizing its own power and control. We see examples of that in public health. You control public health, you control the people. Everyone, we all we share that concern over our own personal health. Put us all together, and that's public health. And you control that, you control the people. Censorship online, other places, a modern surveillance state, watching everything we do. Climate change is one of the most effective propaganda results of propaganda in the history of our country, and the history of the world, actually. Uh, a way to affect and change people's behavior, control people's behavior through this climate change agenda, which is all based on propaganda. And it's all connected to depopulation because people equals carbon and carbon's the enemy. So if we can reduce people, we can reduce carbon and depopulate the globe, which has always been the agenda. It's always been the goal. They've just found a new and better way to go about it through climate change. Uh, how about the minimizing of individual liberties? This is the public interest, right? Maximizing its own power and control first is its own private interest, consolidating control in the hands of fewer and fewer people. The second is the public interest. And how are they attacking that? Freedom of speech, trying to, you see, I saw a statistic. This isn't just restricted here at home. I saw a statistic here recently. It said Britain in the last 6 months has arrested 12,000 people for online media posts, trying to restrict freedom of speech. It's here in the last administration. The federal government, the White House, actually worked with with all of these social media companies, uh, creating target lists, who to censor and who not to censor. The ultimate goal of these is to take away all individual liberties through the Chinese model of a social credit score, where everything you do, every behavior, every thought, every word, everything is controlled. And there's a system of rewards and punishments, and the surveillance makes it possible. The electronic digital surveillance makes it possible. We let that happen, there will be no such thing as individual civil liberties. And then a third part of the ultravires and the contemporary deep state is elimination of the public interest advocate and the firing of somebody who's standing up for the public interest, or the attempted assassination of the public interest advocate. And we've seen that with Elon Musk. They've gone after his businesses. They've gone after him personally. We've seen it over and over and all. He's a non-governmental. He voted for Trump. He supported Trump, but he was sort of apolitical before that. He saw Trump as somebody who was standing on the side of freedom, individual freedom, uh, and so he chose his side, and in doing so became the enemy. And they ran him out of Doge when he bought X to reopen free speech on a social media platform. He instantly became the enemy, right? He basically, in my view, saved free speech in our country and maybe around the world by himself. And then lastly, an ultravires always tries to immunize itself. And here you've seen lately a weaponization of our justice system against enemies. I won't get into that, but it's 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 in the news every day, this weaponization. So in this contemporary deep state era, we've seen aiding and abetting, treason committed by aiding and abetting the enemy, such as in Benghazi, betraying the country, such as in the whole hoax, the Russiagate hoax, which was an attempt to propagandize and run a psyop against the American people, convincing them that a presidential candidate was a puppet of Putin, a Russian puppet. Turns out the whole thing was not true, based on nothing. An attempt to overthrow the government, and that was, in my belief, I believe that was the whole point of COVID, was to overthrow uh, the government through corruption, manipulation of the election, uh, all the mail-in ballots, et cetera, et cetera. And then a killing of the king. How many times has there been assassination attempts against Trump? Just just one the other day, another one. It's like a regular occurrence now. And you start, it's interesting, like in the Butler assassination attempt, within 14 minutes, we knew the alleged assassin's name in Dallas. Here we are, how many months removed? We still don't know anything about this guy, Crooks, the guy who was killed, the alleged assassin in Butler. We know nothing. if we know nothing, there's a reason for that. So I believe this is another deep state attempt of the contemporary deep state to take out an obstacle, a threat to their plans, to their agenda. He's a target. So I've put down here, this is just, we've talked a lot about what happened during the Cold War era, because that's the topic, or that's the subject matter of this particular channel. Well, we are in a new era now, and the new deep state, this contemporary deep state, carries out new operations. And I've just listed some things here that you might just ask yourself, are these deep state operations, did they use the same methods? Did they result in a benefit to this deep state and that could be covered up by this same deep state that we still don't really know the whole truth about? I don't know. I'm not here to prove a case. I'm just listing a few. And the ones I've got highlighted are all wars, which we already have learned is necessary to the carrying out of this business model. But there's other things in here that benefit, in my view, this same deep state, like Oklahoma City. And I could get into the whys and wherefores, why I believe that. But just asking yourself this question, was Oklahoma City what we were told, the narrative that we were told, was that really what happened there? Or was there an ulterior motive that was accomplished to the bombing of that federal building? 9/11 resulted in a, quote, war on terror, and also the Patriot Act, which gave the government wide-ranging surveillance authorities against its own people. We didn't know it at the time. We thought it was necessary to stop a future 9/11 from happening. It's been used now and abused to surveil and spy on American citizens. You wonder if that wasn't the goal all along. The 9/11 uh, folded it within the war on terror was the war on Iraq. And of course, we were sold this line of goods by the intelligence agencies that the reason this was necessary is because Saddam Hussein was stockpiling WMDs. We found out that wasn't true. So the war was completely built on the pretext of a lie, a false flag. He's got nuclear weapons. They could get into the hands of terrorists. So it became part of the war on terror. And here are a bunch of others, but you get to 2022 and the war in Ukraine, which you say, well, we're not over there. Yeah, but we have basically supported that war. How much money have we sent over to Ukraine? That how many weapons systems and supplies, et cetera, et cetera. It's a proxy war. And you think about who the combatant is. Ukraine is the method by which we're by proxy fighting the Soviets. Not the Soviets anymore, the Russians. It's our old boogeyman again, Putin. And so it's sort of a reconstitution of the old Cold War. It's not Afghanistan, it's not Vietnam, now it's Ukraine, but for the same purposes. So these deep state plutocrats, these oligarchs, this plutocracy to run their own foreign policy after propagandizing the American people sufficiently, get them scared of Putin, get them scared of the old communist band getting back together again. And we find out, you go back and you learn the truth about Ukraine, the reason that war happened is because we stuck our nose where it did belong over and over and over. We broke promise after promise after promise. We said we would never ask or include Ukraine in a future NATO. Putin said that was a red line. If you ever do, Ukraine's right on our border. We've been invaded several times through Ukraine. Uh, we won't let that happen. And we just pushed and pushed and pushed until the war happened because we wanted that war. We wanted that war. These deep staters still want that war. And this interesting about this deep state, this contemporary deep state, it doesn't have national boundaries anymore. It's international. It's gone global. So you look at all these folks trying to keep this war going. It's not just here at home, it's abroad. And those trying to end it are not enemies to just the CIA or here at home, the Pentagon. They have enemies abroad who want this war to continue. So the deep state has gone global. And then you see some of these other events I've listed, just throwing it out there to think about, something, food for thought. Are these a continuation of the same deep state, which has morphed over the years? Started off as uh, corporate owners trying to expand markets and get more customers and get more resources. Then it became imperialism, the act of the government, and about new business model, money to be made for continual war. And now it's about this bureaucracy that's supported by these NGOs, and they don't have national boundaries now. They extend it internationally, and they've taken what used to happen here domestically, and they've turned it into something global. And anyone who comes along who represents a threat to that global new world order, that global money spigot, anyone who comes along represents a threat to that has to be neutralized. And as I said, there's been numerous assassinations against attempts on Trump. Charlie Kirk was taken out in 2025. Uh, uh, all kinds of ties when you start looking into these to foreign countries, to intelligence agencies, and back to this deep state. It makes you, once you learn the truth about the 60s and the 70s and this Cold War era deep state, it makes you ask these questions, or at least be skeptical about world events they happen today. Okay, well, that concludes the subject matter of this particular channel. I think we ended up with 61 total chapters, and my next project will be to uh, put this down on paper. I'm going to be putting it on my Patreon channel and also my Substack as I work my way through chapter after chapter after chapter, writing essentially what I've just recorded. And maybe one day it'll be a book. I don't know. We'll see. But I thank all of you who have stayed with me and listened and participated in this process as we worked our way through. And I'm sure we'll see each other in the near future as I continue on my other channel, the Standards Plus History Academy channel, as I continue to add to that here and there. Until we meet again, God bless. Thank you.